At a bank near Three Forks, Montana, the Missouri River begins as water moving past gravel, mud, and grass. Reeds lean over the edge, cottonwoods stand farther back, and the channel runs through the open valley. Here, the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers come together in southwestern Montana. Their separate currents meet, and the Missouri becomes a river of its own. Seen from here, it is hard to imagine how far this water will continue across the central United States. It slips past gravel bars and cottonwood shade, moving away from the meeting place and into the valley ahead. High in the Centennial Mountains, west of Yellowstone, the farthest headwater ground of the Missouri system lies around the upper Hell-Roaring Creek drainage, near Brower's Spring. There is no formed riverbank here yet. The slope is exposed, rock, gravelly soil, short grass, and low alpine plants pressed close to the ground. Water appears first in small wet patches, where the earth darkens between stones. One thread slips from under gravel, then another shows lower down, narrow enough to disappear behind a tuft of grass before it is visible again. Meltwater crosses bare stone in thin lines, gathers below a small rise, and enters softer ground. In places, the water is only a shine on rock or a darker seam beside a grass stem. At roughly 8,800 to 9,400 feet, depending on the exact point used, the beginning is not broad or easy to mark. It is mountain ground, with scattered wet places, all tilted toward the same descent. The first movement comes from ordinary high country processes working at the same time. Snowmelt enters the slope, spring water reaches the surface, seepage moves through loose ground, and runoff follows the easiest line between rock and soil. On firm stone, water skims in a narrow sheen. In open gravel, part of the flow sinks, then appears again lower on the slope. Small channels begin as shallow marks rather than clean cuts. Wet soil holds their shape for a while, and the next meltwater uses the same slight depression. Gravel moves slowly, first as loose grains, then as small patches shifted by repeated flow. Where the slope steepens, the water has enough force to clear a thin groove between stones. Where the ground flattens, it spreads, slows, and leaves damp edges before drawing together again. A narrow line becomes more dependable because the slope keeps sending water back to the same low path. Around Brower's Spring and the upper Hell-Roaring Creek area, the beginning is not a single neat point in the ground. It is a small drainage network. Spring flow, seepage, tiny rills, and short-lived surface water appear after melting snow or weather passing over the high divide. Some of the water is visible only as damp ground, a darker strip under grass, or a faint line touching the edges of stones. Other parts hold together long enough to form a narrow creek. The pattern is uneven because the ground is uneven. Rock, slope angle, soil depth, and vegetation decide whether water sinks, runs across the surface, or stays visible in a thread. This upper drainage is the farthest accepted source landscape of the Missouri system. The Missouri itself does not receive its official name here. That comes much farther downstream near Three Forks, where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin meet. On this high slope, the water is still in its first assembling stage, before those larger river names begin. The work of the water is small, but it is already physical. It loosens fine gravel from the side of a shallow cut, slides grains downstream, and leaves firmer edges where roots hold the soil. Grass bends along the wet line, and low plants mark the places where water returns more often than on the drier ground beside it. In small dips, the flow gathers long enough to deepen the cut by a few more centimeters. In colder parts of the season, thawing and refreezing open tiny gaps, and running water uses them when melt returns. These first edges are not proper banks yet, but they start the habit of a channel. The same line receives water again, carries sediment again, and becomes easier for later flow to follow. From this mountain ground, water feeds Hell-Roaring Creek, then continues into the Red Rock, the Beaverhead, and the Jefferson before the named Missouri. forms at three forks. As the small flow leaves the exposed slope, it becomes easier to follow with the eye. Separate wet lines join into a clearer thread, and the thread begins to hold its course through gravel, grass, and low cuts in the ground. The movement is still narrow and close to the mountain's surface, but it is no longer scattered across the slope. It has begun to travel as Hell-Roaring Creek, carrying the first high water away from Brower's Spring and into the next part of the drainage. Below the upper wet ground, the channel can keep its line for longer stretches, receive more runoff from side slopes, and cut a clearer course through the valley floor. It is still small enough to belong to the mountain's surface, but it now has direction and a channel it can keep. The river is not yet the Missouri by name, and it is not yet broad water in an open valley. It is a young creek gaining continuity, moving away from the high exposed ground toward the first clear course that carries the system onward. Below the upper wet ground, Hell-Roaring Creek begins to hold together as a visible line. It runs through a narrow bed of gravel, exposed soil, and unsettled stones. In some places the current is only a thin sheet crossing the surface. In others, it gathers into a small cut where the slope gives it more pull. The banks are low and uneven, closer to broken edges than formed sides, with loose sediment caught against roots and grass. Mountain plants grow tight to the channel where the ground stays damp. A short distance away, the drier gravel remains pale and open, separated from the wet edge by only a few feet of rough ground. The creek is still small enough to step across in places, but it has begun to move as one course. Water that was scattered above now stays in the bed for longer stretches, turning around stones, sliding through shallow runs, and following the tilt of the land downhill. The separate trickles that feed this channel do not arrive with the same force. Some enter from shallow side cuts. Some slide in from wet soil. Others join after snowmelt or runoff has crossed the slope. Gravity gives the water its direction, and the ground fixes where that direction can continue. A slight hollow holds more flow than the bare surface beside it. Softer soil lets water press lower into the slope. A line between stones becomes a passage, and the next flow uses it again. Over time, these small features of terrain become a continuous bed. The water no longer spreads evenly across the ground, or loses itself each time the surface changes. It gathers in the lowest cuts, turns where the bank resists, and keeps moving where the path is open enough to carry it. A side thread may enter at an angle, disturb the surface for a few moments, and then disappear into the main line, adding to the flow without changing its narrow course. The bed takes shape through repeated flow, not through one sudden break in the land. Fine soil moves first, lifting into the current when the water quickens over a steeper patch. Loose gravel shifts next, rolling a short distance before settling where the current weakens. Heavier stones stay in place and make the creek bend around them, splitting the surface into small ripples before the water joins again below. Where exposed rock crosses the channel, the flow skims over it or runs along its edge. Where the ground is softer, the water cuts a little deeper and leaves a sharper mark. Sediment gathers on the inside of a turn, while the outer edge is pressed and worn more often. After many small rises in flow, the bed becomes less accidental. Its roughness remains, with small drops, uneven patches, and exposed stones, but the water has begun to sort the loose material, carrying finer grains onward and leaving a firmer pattern in the channel. Close to the banks, the first course alters the surrounding ground in small, visible ways. Damp margins appear beside the bed after snowmelt, and narrow strips of grass hold where roots can grip the soil. Gravel bars form in low patches where the current slows and drops its load. During stronger runoff, the creek spreads briefly over these edges, covering pale stones with a thin layer of moving water before pulling back into the main cut. In tighter places, stones sit close together and divide the water into shallow threads. In looser places, the edges crumble and are rebuilt a little farther downstream. A narrow, wet line remains on the bank after the water level falls, showing the creek's recent height. These changes set the small limits of the channel, where plants can hold, where bare gravel remains open, and where the next rise of water will spread first. The channel is not fixed, and it may shift after stronger runoff, but the nearby surface is beginning to form around it. Farther down from the rough upper drainage, the creek holds its line for longer stretches. The current still bends around stones and slips over gravel, but the bed can now be followed through the high ground. Side water enters from damp cuts and small runs without scattering the course apart. The small channel takes it in, deepens slightly, and carries it onward through the bed. As the gradient eases, the flow slows over gravel patches, then tightens again where the bed narrows. Hell-roaring Creek leaves the steepest source ground behind and begins to feed the early red rock drainage, where the water will have more room to keep its direction across a broader valley floor. Here, the first course is no longer scattered runoff finding a low place. It is a young channel, narrow and active, moving downstream with enough continuity for the next stretch of the river to begin. At the Missouri headwaters near Three Forks, the rivers meet in open valley ground bordered by low bluffs, limestone, grass, and worn river edges. The Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin arrive from different directions, each carrying its own current, then gather into the named Missouri. Close to the water, the place is practical before it is symbolic. Gravel bars give firm footing in low water. Cottonwoods and willow growth mark damp ground near the channels. Trails could keep to the valley floor or turn toward neighboring drainages. A camp here had water, visibility, and room to move. A crossing here joined one valley to another. The confluence was not a distant point on a map. It was open ground beside moving water, with stone nearby, animals within reach, and routes leading out through the headwaters country. The river meeting made sense first at ground level, where feet, water, and valley openings came together. Long before the headwaters were written into expedition records, this area belonged to a broader native travel and used landscape. Shoshone people knew the upper valleys and returned seasonally to parts of this region. Blackfeet, Crow, Hidatsa, Salish, Kootenai, and other native peoples also moved through or contested the wider headwaters country at different times. The geography made the place useful. Valleys opened routes through mountain country. Rivers and creeks offered water, fish, and natural lines of travel. Grasslands and slopes held game, while higher ground gave wider views across the corridors below. A group could camp near the river, follow animals into adjacent country, or move between drainages without losing contact with water. The same open routes that made the headwaters useful also made them contested. Knowledge of crossings, seasonal paths, and hunting grounds shaped travel, safety, and return. The cultural layer is best kept close to physical traces and named places, not forced into invented ceremony. In the headwaters area, faint pictographs on stone surfaces show that people marked parts of this landscape, though the surviving images should not be made to carry more story than they can support. Nearby stone resources tied people to the ground in practical ways. Toolstone could be found, worked, carried, and traded, leaving evidence of repeated use around the valleys and uplands. Rock faces stood near water. River edges gave campable ground. Open corridors led toward other valleys. Long before the tributaries received the names now printed on maps, a person moving through this country would not have seen a single isolated source scene. They would have seen water routes, usable stone, dry approaches above wet ground, and valley openings leading toward other known places. Sacagawea's recognition of the area gave one of the clearest recorded signs that the headwaters were already part of a lived human landscape. When the Lewis and Clark expedition reached the Three Forks region, she recognized parts of the country from her Shoshone childhood. Her people had used the area seasonally, and her memory of the landscape connected the expedition's route to older patterns of movement. The river edges, open ground, and nearby valleys were not empty scenery waiting to be described. They were part of a homeland with paths, camps, and family history. That recognition affected the expedition's movement through the place. It pointed towards Shoshone presence, possible contact, and the practical need for horses to continue over the mountains. At the headwaters, different ways of knowing the ground came close together. Lived return and seasonal use on one side, travel records and written names on the other. At the confluence, later naming placed another layer over the older landscape. Lewis and Clark gave the three joining rivers the names Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, attaching national political geography to waters already known and used through native roots and local experience. The new names made the headwaters easier to record for the expedition and for later maps, but they did not create the human meaning of the place. That meaning had already been formed through camping, crossing, hunting, stone use, and repeated movement along the valleys. Seen from the riverbank, the layers remain close together, current folding into current, trails keeping to workable ground, rock rising near open water, and names resting on a landscape shaped before them. The written names sit on the surface of a place already used, crossed, remembered, and returned to. From here, the human record settles back into the land itself, where the next shape of the Missouri headwaters is written in stone, soil, slope, and the older form of the valley. Near the headwaters valley around Three Forks, the young Missouri moves beside low banks, gravel bars, and exposed soil. The ground at the river edge is uneven, built from loose sediment that has been cut, dropped, and moved again by water from the joining channels. In places, the bank breaks into layers of sand, silt, and small stones. In others, the current runs close to firmer ground, where rock slopes rise beyond the open valley floor. The river is not crossing a blank surface. It is passing through a basin with edges, old slopes, and resistant outcrops already shaping the space around it. A bend forms where the water meets a firmer bank. A bar appears where the current slows and leaves gravel in a shallow curve. Below the surface, the bed shifts from soft patches to packed stones and back again. The visible channel is being guided by the materials under and beside it. The Three Forks Basin gives the early river a prepared setting. Its valley floor has been filled over time, with sediment washed down from surrounding uplands, while faulted basin edges and nearby mountain fronts hold the open ground within limits. Older rock masses stand beyond the softer bottomlands, making harder boundaries against which water has fewer choices. The river and its tributaries follow the lower, easier ground. The path is not straight, but the basin gives room in some places and closes that room in others. Where sediment lies deep, channels can shift across the bottomland. Where the valley edge tightens, or harder ground comes nearer to the water, the channel has to turn, narrow, or press against the available space. Even a small rise in the valley floor can hold water to one side. A lower margin can let it spread thinly before it returns to the cut. Small differences in height decide whether water spreads across a flat margin or stays confined in a deeper cut. The basin's shape becomes part of the river's first direction. That direction is adjusted at the scale of the channel itself. Softer banks can be cut during stronger flow, leaving a fresh edge where soil has fallen into the water. Loose gravel can be lifted, rolled, and set down a short distance away. Finer material travels farther, clouding the current for a time before settling in slower water. Harder rock layers and low bluffs change more slowly. They hold their line while the current works around them, making the water bend rather than cut straight through. On the inside of a bend, gravel and sand collect in shallow bars. Along the outside, the bank is pressed more often and worn more sharply. When the water falls, the new edge remains as a small step of raw soil above the current. These changes do not need one violent flood to appear. Repeated flow is enough to sort the bed, trim the weaker edges, and make the channel more defined against the uneven ground. Near the meeting of the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin, the land still shows where moving channels have worked across the headwaters' bottomland. River edges have shifted over time, leaving damp, low places, abandoned cuts, and bars that sit slightly above ordinary water. A channel may tighten against a firmer bank, then spread where the valley floor opens and the current loses force. After higher water, fine sediment can remain on a low margin, while gravel is left in a patch where the flow slowed. Cottonwoods and willows take hold where damp ground is stable enough for roots. Bare bars remain where the river still rearranges the surface. Even a small side channel can leave a curved mark in the grass before drying back to a shallow depression. Geology is not distant here. It is in the bank that collapses, the stone that stays, the bar that grows, and the low bottom that remains wet after the main water has drawn back. Below the confluence, the named Missouri continues through ground already shaped by rock strength, sediment depth, and slope. Its first organized movement is broad enough to hold a clear course, but still close enough to the basin floor for each bank and bar to matter. The current follows the easiest line through the valley, touching soft margins, turning from firmer edges, and carrying small loads of sediment downstream. The surrounding land does not simply receive the river. It limits, redirects, and stores part of its movement in gravel, damp soil, and shallow abandoned lines. As the channel leaves the headwaters area, the same formed valley will respond differently with each rise and fall of water. A high flow may reopen a side cut. A lower season may leave gravel dry beside the channel. The next change comes through season. Snowmelt, runoff, low water, and the repeated return of flow through the same shaped ground. As winter loosens in the upper Missouri headwaters, the channel changes first at the edges. Water rises over gravel that had been dry or held in frost, and the current runs cold against the low banks. Fine sediment lifts from the bed and clouds the shallow runs before settling below the faster water. Small stones shift where the flow tightens, leaving lighter gravel on the inside of bends. Grass at the margin lies flattened against wet soil, and thawed bank material breaks more easily under the current. At narrow turns, the surface runs faster against the outside edge. The river is not only fuller, it carries the weight of snow stored for months in the high country. As that snow enters the drainage, the channel shows it in level, speed, and the raw look of ground recently moved. In the upper headwaters, winter snow holds water high in the mountains until warmer days reach the slopes. When the frozen surface gives way, the release fills the channel more steadily than a passing storm. In spring and early summer, the current spreads across low gravel bars, pushes into side edges, and covers stones that were exposed during colder months. Water that once passed through a narrow line now occupies more of the bed, pressing against roots and soft banks. Stronger flow carries fine sand and silt downstream. Gravel rolls in short movements where the current has enough force to lift it. A side cut that seemed dry late in the season may briefly take moving water again. During these weeks, banks soften, shallow bars are trimmed, and the main current finds the deeper path through a bed it has already worked before. The channel does not need to change everywhere at once. A raw bank, a shifted bar, and a faster run are enough to show the season in the bed. By late summer, the same channel shows the opposite condition. As snowmelt weakens and heat stays longer over the valley, the water drops back from its high edges. Gravel bars reappear in pale strips, with only the lowest stones still touched by the current. The main flow becomes easier to separate from the slower margins, where water turns in small eddies or rests in shallow pockets along the bank. In the shallows, the water warms more quickly as it passes over exposed stones and open sediment. Under shaded edges, colder water can linger close to roots and undercut banks. Damp margins remain after the level falls, showing where the channel had spread earlier in the season. In dry years, the contraction is sharper. The channel may still carry a clear line of moving water, but its reach across the bed is reduced. Side threads weaken, small cuts dry into shallow marks, and the bank keeps a narrow record of where higher water stood weeks before. A stone that was buried under runoff in June may sit dry by August, with only a dark stain below it. The seasonal rise and fall also changes how the bank can be used. In high water, a soft edge may be too unstable for easy access, and a crossing that looked simple in late summer can become cold, fast, and unsafe. After the level falls, stones hidden under runoff appear again, and shallow places can be reached without stepping into the main current. Vegetation follows the same pattern of exposure and wetness. Willow roots hold some fresh sediment in place, while bare gravel remains open where the current has recently swept across it. Local water use becomes more sensitive after the snowmelt pulse has passed. Irrigation ditches, stock access, and small diversions depend on water that is lower and more concentrated in the main cut. At the river edge, the season can be read in crossing depth, damp soil, exposed roots, and the amount of moving water still available against the bank. When cold returns, the channel enters a slower state. Freezing nights leave ice along margins, in slack water, and around stones close to the bank. The main current may continue through the centre, darker and narrower between frozen edges, while shallow side water stiffens first. Sediment movement lessens as the flow drops and the bed holds more firmly under cold conditions. After each season, the channel keeps a visible record. Fresh gravel after high water, exposed bars after dry weeks, softened banks where runoff pressed hard, and thin ice where winter begins to close the margins. The Missouri headwaters do not keep one steady form through the year. They rise, draw back, cool, and loosen according to snow, heat, and frost. Along these changing edges, the next human use of the river would have to follow timing as much as place, returning to banks that were never quite the same from one season to the next. At a side stream mouth, the smaller current enters the Missouri through a low break in the bank. Its water comes over gravel and silt, then slips into the main channel at an angle. For a short distance, the two flows remain visible beside each other. One line runs faster along the outside of the mouth, while the other turns more slowly beside damp grass and exposed roots. Fine sediment lifts where the currents meet, stretches downstream, and thins into the larger flow. The bank changes shape around the joining place. Gravel gathers in a small fan, the margin stays wetter than the ground beside it, and the main current bends slightly around the added water. A few inches of new depth can cover low stones and pull loose grains into motion. The river grows by this kind of contact. A smaller channel reaches it, brings its own movement, and the Missouri carries the change downstream. Below the headwaters, the river gains scale through repeated additions. Water enters from side valleys, spring-fed runs, seepage through saturated banks, and groundwater below the surface, where it is not always visible. A narrow creek may add only a small push along the edge. A larger mountain-fed tributary may deepen the current and widen the working bed. The Dearborn and Smith bring water from their own drainages into the upper Missouri region. Farther downstream, the Sun and Marias add larger northern contributions. Each addition gives the main channel more water to hold. The result depends on the banks and bed. In one reach, the river widens. In another, it deepens. And in a narrow place, it may quicken. More volume also gives the current greater ability to lift and carry material. A reach that once moved around, exposed stones may later cover them. A shallow bar may be trimmed at its edge. A bend may begin to press harder against its outside bank as more water passes through the same curve. Not every tributary changes the Missouri in the same way. A cold side stream from higher ground may enter with clearer water and gravel during the spring rise, adding force close to the bed. Another tributary may bring finer sediment from softer valley ground, turning the mixing line cloudy after rain. Springs and groundwater seepage enter more quietly, cooling a small margin or keeping a damp edge active after surface runoff has weakened. Some flows remain steady enough to be noticed through the season. Others arrive strongly for a short period, then fall back and leave only a shallow cut at the bank. The difference remains visible in the bed. Below one mouth, there may be fresh gravel and a stronger run. Below another, fine sediment may settle in a slower margin or along the inside of a bend. The Missouri becomes larger through these additions, but not more uniform. Its water carries different temperatures, grains, and timing from the country that drains into it. At tributary mouths, the banks often show the work of two currents instead of one. A gravel fan may spread where the side stream loses speed on entering the larger channel. A damp margin may hold sedges, willow shoots, and soft mud where water lingers after the level falls. Fish can use these joining places as movement routes, passing between the main river and smaller water when depth, temperature, and season allow it. For people moving along the river, a tributary mouth changes the practical shape of the bank. It may offer access to a side valley, a break in the bank, a fishing place, or a shallow crossing when the water is low enough. It can also make the main river harder to read. The current may quicken below the join, bars may shift near the mouth, and the bank may be less firm where two channels have recently worked the same ground. At the edge of the water, a tributary changes footing, flow, and the way the river can be approached. After several side waters have entered, the Missouri no longer has the same scale it held near the confluence at Three Forks. It carries more volume, more sediment, and more evidence of the valleys that have fed it. The main current has a fuller body, while the banks show repeated adjustments. Fresh deposits beside slow water, cut edges at bends, damp low places near tributary mouths, and bars made from material brought in and sorted downstream. The river is still guided by its valley and by the strength of its banks, but it now draws from a broader drainage. Water added from one valley becomes part of the same surface that passes the next bank, the next bar, and the next bend. Each new addition enters the moving channel, not as a separate line, but as water folded into the Missouri's own course. From here, the growing river begins to offer more than movement through open ground. It becomes a place where access, water supply, fish, crossings, and workable banks can shape where people pause, travel, and eventually settle beside it. At the edge of the Missouri floodplain, the main current can run close to water that is almost still. A low chute leaves the river through a shallow opening, passes behind a sandbar, and slows beside muddy ground. Reeds stand in the wet margin, and willow roots hold the bank where the soil stays dark. In a nearby backwater, the surface is shallow enough for low sand to show through, with fine silt lying over the bed. A side channel may stay partly connected to the river at one end, while the other fades into damp grass and soft mud. The active current is only a few steps away, but the movement here is different. Water enters, turns, loses speed, and spreads against low floodplain ground. The margin keeps the mark of the last rise. Bent grass, drifted stems, fresh sediment around roots, and a thin line of damp soil above the present water. When the Missouri rises, part of its flow leaves the main channel and enters the lower ground beside it. Water passes into side channels, sloughs, and backwaters, where the current slows as the space widens and the slope weakens. A chute may carry moving water behind an island or sandbar, then return it downstream with less force. A wet meadow may take only a thin sheet of water, spreading it across grass before it sinks, drains back, or remains in shallow pools. As the current loses speed, heavier grains settle first, then finer silt lies across mud and roots. The floodplain does not stop the river. It gives the river room to spend part of its force outside the deepest channel. High water that would press hard against one bank is divided into slower margins, side paths, and low basins. When the level falls again, some water returns to the main current, while some remains as side water held in old cuts and shallow depressions. The shape of this side water comes from cutting and deposition along the same corridor. A stronger current can open a new path through low ground. Later, slower water drops sand and begins to close part of that path again. A narrow chute may stay open for several seasons, then fill at one end as sediment gathers. An oxbow or backwater marks where the river once turned through a different line, leaving a curved piece of water beside the active channel. These forms are not scenery placed near the Missouri. They are former or partial movements of the river, left in the floodplain after the main current shifted. Sandbars grow where water slows. Damp edges form where fine sediment settles. Shallow beds become firm enough for reeds and young willows to take hold, and their roots hold more silt the next time water spreads across the margin. A low place that looks separate in dry weather may still belong to the river when the channel rises. In these slower places, life uses conditions that the main current cannot always provide. Young fish can move into shallow side channels, where the water is less forceful than the central run. Birds feed along wet mud and exposed sand, while amphibians use quiet pools that stay after the river has fallen. Cottonwoods and willows depend on damp, disturbed ground, where seeds can settle and roots can reach moisture before the surface dries. Reed beds mark places where fine sediment and standing water remain long enough for plants to hold. These same features make the river harder to read from the bank. The main channel may look like the only river, but water also lies in backwaters, low swales, detached sandbars, and damp bottoms behind the visible edge. In restoration work along the Missouri, shallow water habitats such as side channels, backwaters, and sandbar margins are treated as working parts of the river corridor. They give shelter, movement routes, and places where sediment and water can slow. After high water draws back, the floodplain keeps the marks of the work it has done. A thin layer of silt rests over low grass. Mud holds the shape of bird tracks near a backwater edge. Sand lies in a fresh strip behind a bar, and a side channel that carried moving water now holds only a narrow pool or a damp bed. The main Missouri continues downstream, but its banks have been changed by the water that left and returned. A margin has softened. A bar has been extended. A patch of willow has trapped sediment that may lift the ground a little higher over time. The river is wider than the line of current seen from one bank. It includes the wet ground beside it, the slow water behind bars, and the low places that receive flow when the channel rises. Along this broader corridor, later crossings, fields, paths, and working places would form beside a river whose usable edge was always changing. Near the Missouri and Knife River confluence, village ground sits close to water but above the lowest exposed edge. Below the terrace, the riverbank holds cottonwood, willow, damp soil, and worn paths leading down toward the channel. The Missouri moves past wooded margins, while the Knife River brings another line of water through nearby bottomland. On higher ground, earth lodge village sites were placed where people could reach the rivers without building directly in the most flood-prone ground. Water was near enough for daily use. Trees grew along the banks. Rich soil lay within reach of the village. From the terrace, people could look across the river corridor, move toward fields, and return to lodges set above the wettest margins. The bank below belonged to the settlement's working space, with paths, trees, water, and usable soil close together. But the lodges held to ground that gave more security when the rivers rose. For Mandan, Hidatsa, and later Arikara communities in the upper Missouri village world, the river was part of the daily working ground. Drinking water, washing water, and bathing water came from a channel that also supplied fish and drew animals into the valley. River clay could be gathered for pottery, shaped by hand, and fired for storage and cooking. Cottonwood provided larger timber for earth lodge frames, while willow served lighter construction and woven work. These materials were not distant from the village edge. They stood or lay along the same banks where paths reached the water. The river corridor also gave direction to travel. A person following it could move through the valley, pass between village sites, or meet others arriving by water or along the same low ground. The settlement used the river not as a distant resource, but as an edge returned to again and again through the day, for water, material, movement, and contact. The farming ground near these villages was tied to the river's seasonal behavior. Spring flooding could spread water and fine sediment across low fields and bottomland, renewing soil that would later dry enough to plant. Corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers grew near the villages, with stored crops held inside earth lodge communities built for longer residence. The fields needed ground that was rich, workable, and close enough to tend, but not so low that every rise of water would damage them. Terrace placement answered that condition. Lodges stood above the most vulnerable floodplain, while fields and gathering places remained connected to the river below. Stored harvests, drying racks, and prepared food tied the village to a growing season made possible by the bank and its renewed soil. The village form followed both water and ground, permanent enough to store food and support repeated occupation, but placed with close attention to flood, bank, field, and path. Around the village edge, river use formed routines, visible in movement across the ground. Paths led down from lodges to water, clay, wood, and places where boats or bullboats could be handled near the bank. A landing had to be close enough to reach, with water deep enough at ordinary levels, and ground firm enough for carrying loads back up toward the village. Fishing places were chosen where the current, side water, or bank shape made work possible. Crossings depended on season and depth. A safe place in one part of the year could become too strong, cold, or unstable in another. Visitors, traders, and neighbouring groups could approach along the same river corridor, so the bank was also a place of contact. Yet the scale remained practical. Footsteps to the water, wood brought from the margin, clay carried back from the bank, and fields tended on ground made useful by the river. Below the village, the Missouri continued past fields, lodges, paths, planted ground, and working edges. Its water carried sediment along the bank, undercut some places, and left fresh material in others. A stand of willow marked a damp line where roots held the soil. Cottonwood trunks rose above the lower margin, close enough to show where the river supported growth, but far enough from the main lodges to keep the settlement on safer ground. The village was not beside the river by accident. It stood where water, timber, clay, fish, fields, and travel could be reached without giving up the advantage of higher land. As the current moved beyond the confluence country and past these settled banks, it entered a wider human landscape of paths, seasonal movement, older use, and work shaped by the same changing edge of water. A worn path near the Missouri or Knife River begins on terrace ground and drops toward the bank through grass, exposed soil, and cottonwood shade. It is not a road in the later sense, only a line made by return. Feet use the same slope because the water is reachable there and the ground is firm enough to hold. Below it, a landing opens where the bank is less steep, with trampled earth near the current and roots showing through the edge. The river moves past in a working channel, close enough for water, fish, clay, and wood to be reached without crossing unstable low ground. Above the bank, the terrace gives drier footing and a wider view across the floodplain. Between terrace and water, the path marks the daily movement from higher living ground to the river edge. The bank becomes a place shaped by use as much as by current. Ordinary activity gathered where the river made movement predictable. A crossing was chosen where the water spread shallow over gravel, or where the banks gave a clean approach from both sides. A fishing place formed where currents slowed along an edge, below a bend, or near side water that held fish away from the strongest flow. Clay could be taken from exposed river deposits. Stone or wood could be gathered from nearby ground and carried back along the same worn lines. Temporary camps made sense close to water when people were travelling, hunting, visiting, or working away from a main village. The river gave direction through the valley, and it gave repeated stopping places. A firm landing, a usable bank, a known bend, a sheltered backwater. Over time, these points began to order movement. A large town was not needed for the river corridor to become organized. The pattern came from returning to the same useful places. In the upper Missouri and Knife River region, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara presence was tied to settled village life and to movement through the surrounding river country. Fields near villages needed attention through the growing season, but river use also extended outward to fishing places, wood-gathering areas, clay sources, and paths between communities. A group could leave a village terrace, follow the bank toward a working place, or move along the corridor to another settlement. Seasonal travel did not weaken the place of permanent villages. It connected them to familiar edges and routes beyond the lodge ground. In one season, the river might support planting and fieldwork near the bottomland. In another, it might guide hunting travel, visits, or the gathering of materials from exposed banks and wooded margins. The same channel that watered fields also linked places where work, movement, and return could happen without leaving the river's line. The traces left by this use were small and practical. A path down the bank could become slightly hollowed by repeated steps, with bare soil showing through the grass. A landing area might stay open because loads were carried there, boats were handled there, or people stood at the same slope to reach the water. Near a field edge, worked soil changed the surface behind the bank, while crop storage and lodge life remained higher on safer ground. At a fishing spot, the usable place was marked by access, a firm edge, a calmer pocket of water, or a bend where the current could be read. Clay taken from a bank left a cut face that weather and high water might later soften. Wood handled near the river left open patches beneath cottonwood and willow. These marks could be covered, shifted, or erased by flood and sediment, but while they lasted, they showed the river edge turned into a working surface. The Missouri moved past these used edges without separating natural channel from human movement. Its current undercut some banks, left sediment on others, and changed the easiest places to approach from one season to the next. Paths, fields, camps, fishing places, and landing slopes had to follow those changes. Before larger towns and fixed riverfronts became dominant, the corridor was already organized by repeated practical decisions. Where the bank held, where water could be reached, where a crossing was possible, where materials could be gathered, and where people could pause while moving along the valley. The river carried water past these places, but it also gave them sequence. One workable edge led to another. One path met another near the channel. A landing connected to a terrace, a field to a bank, a crossing to a route beyond the water. As the Missouri continued downstream, it passed through a human landscape already shaped by return, access, and movement, ready to become a more deliberate route for travel, crossings, boats, and wider exchange. At a working landing along the Missouri, the bank slopes down in a worn line of packed earth and trampled grass. The water is close enough for a boat to touch the edge, but the ground is firm enough for people to step between channel and shore without sinking into mud. A craft can be tied where roots or posts hold, its side resting near the current while bundles, tools, hides, food, or trade goods are lifted out and set on the bank. The landing is not apart from the river. It is the place where movement on water changes into movement on foot. Marks in the soil show where loads have been carried up the slope. Grass is flattened where people waited or turned. A shallow rut may lead toward higher ground, cut by repeated steps rather than wheels. At the edge, the Missouri becomes a route only where the bank allows the route to be used. Boats made that route practical by carrying weight through country where overland movement could be slow and uneven. A loaded craft could follow the current downstream, keeping to the deeper line where the channel held enough water. Smaller boats could work closer to the bank, entering quieter margins or pulling in below a bend where the current relaxed. Movement required attention to the surface. A pale bar under shallow water could stop a heavy load. A snag could turn a simple approach into a hazard. A fast bend might push the boat away from the chosen landing, while a calmer reach allowed people to bring it in with less force. The useful river was not a straight open road. It had to be read from the water. The darker run, the broken ripple, the smooth patch near a bank, and the low place where cargo could be handled. Even a short stop depended on finding a bank that would hold under feet. The route also continued beside the water. Footpaths followed the bank where boats could not pass easily, and repeated crossings joined one working edge to another. At some places, people carried goods around shallow or difficult reaches before returning to the channel. At others, a ferry point or crossing formed where both banks gave enough room to approach and leave the water. In stronger current, ropes, poles, and towing from the edge could support movement that the channel alone did not make easy. When ice held the margins, when low water exposed bars, or when bends and driftwood blocked a safe line, the land beside the river became part of the same route. The Missouri was not only the moving water, it was the channel, the landing slope, the bank path, the crossing, and the short dry stretch where people shifted from boat to foot and back again. Regular use made certain banks busier than others. A reliable landing could become a meeting point because it gave access to water and firm ground at the same time. Traders and local communities could handle exchange close to the bank, where goods moved from boats to paths, from paths to camps, or from nearby fields and settlements back toward the channel. A bundle set down on packed soil, a boat pulled into slack water, and a trail leading away from the river belonged to the same working pattern. The landing did not need permanent buildings to have order. Its order came from use. The best place to step ashore, the driest place to lay goods, the safest place to turn an animal or carry a load, and the path that led to higher ground. Around these points, the river became daily infrastructure, shaped by approach, handling, waiting, and departure. The bank held the pauses between movement, and those pauses made the route usable. The surface still set the limits. In one season, the Missouri might carry a boat cleanly past a bar that would stand exposed later in the year. In another, ice could close the edge or make the landing too uncertain to use. Low water could force a craft away from the bank, while high water could cover the firm footing that made access possible. Bends, snags, shifting channels, and shallow crossings controlled movement as much as intention did. Each trip depended on the river's condition, the load, the bank, and the next place where stopping was possible. As people used the Missouri more deliberately as a route, they marked its edges more deliberately as well. Paths held their lines, ferry points became known, crossings were chosen, and banks were cleared or repaired for repeated access. A landing that worked in one season might be strengthened, adjusted, or avoided in the next. A safe edge became worth remembering, only because it could fail. The river moved on, but its working margins were becoming more clearly organized by travel. At a fortified post above a working edge of the Missouri, the cleared bank drops toward a place where boats can be brought close enough to unload. A stockade or heavy-built enclosure stands back from the water on firmer ground, with its gate turned toward the landing and the path inland. Inside or beside it, goods are kept under cover. Packed bales, tools, barrels, food sacks, and repair materials for the craft tied below. A small open yard gives space for sorting and checking before anything is carried farther from the shore. The post does not need height like a castle to hold the place. Its strength comes from placement. From the bank, the channel can be watched as it bends past, and from the gate, movement between water and shore can be directed. Anyone arriving by boat has to use the same narrow slope, the same trampled approach, and the same visible space between current and enclosure. At such points, control began with ordinary movement. A boat could not unload everywhere with the same safety. The bank had to be firm enough to stand on, close enough to the channel, and connected to a path beyond the river. When a landing was guarded or managed, cargo passed through a chosen edge rather than any open stretch of mud and grass. Men stepped from the boat under observation. Bundles were lifted to a place where they could be counted, stored, exchanged, or held until the next movement was ready. A ferry crossing worked in the same practical way. The useful approach became the watched approach, Travellers waited where the boat could take them across. Animals were gathered near the slope. The easiest passage from one bank to the other became a point where access could be granted, delayed, priced, or refused. The power lay in the routine. The boat pulled in, the load came ashore, the crossing was arranged, and each movement passed through a few visible yards of bank. Trade and communication followed the same narrow lines. A post on the Missouri was not only shelter beside moving water, it was a receiving place for furs, hides, tools, food, powder, rope, and instructions carried by boat crews or by people coming overland to the bank. Messages moved with supplies, folded into the same routine of landing, unloading, speaking, waiting, and setting out again. Local communities, traders, soldiers, and officials met at these edges because the river gave them a shared route and the bank gave them a place to stop. The warehouse, the ferry house, the landing shed, or the enclosed yard made one piece of shoreline more active than the open ground beside it. What passed through could be watched because it first had to be brought close, set down, handled, and sent onward from a limited space. A load that touched the bank entered a system of eyes, gates, paths, and storage. Around these controlled points, the nearby landscape began to arrange itself. A footpath bent toward the landing because that was where goods came in. A road hardened where carts or teams moved between the river and higher ground. Small buildings gathered where people had reason to wait, repair, store, trade, or ask for passage. At a crossing, worn ground showed repeated use before any permanent bridge arrived. Later, a bridge approach could fix the same control in heavier form, drawing traffic toward a ramp, a pier, or a guarded entrance. The settlement did not have to be large for the effect to be visible. A few buildings, a fenced yard, a ferry line, and a track leading away from the bank were enough to show movement gathered into one place. Work then followed the access point. Loads were weighed, boats were mended, teams were turned around, and people learned which bank was safest to use when the water was high. But the Missouri did not hold still for every plan placed along it. Ice could close a crossing, floods could climb over the landing, and a bank that seemed firm in one season could be cut back or buried in another. Sandbars shifted in the channel. A difficult bend could slow a boat before it reached the watched edge, or push the current away from a once useful slope. Even a strong post depended on the river remaining close enough, deep enough, and predictable enough to use. A landing that served one season might need work the next, with brush cleared again, posts reset, or the approach cut into a new angle of bank. Along the controlled edge, power was practical and unfinished, tied to posts, ferries, stored goods, paths, and the changing line of water. Each piece had to be kept usable. As people tried to make access more dependable, temporary edges began to harden into embankments, piers, ramps, and other works built to hold the river's use in place. At a ferry landing on the Missouri, a road comes down from higher ground and breaks into ruts near the prepared bank. The last stretch is no longer a natural path. It has been cut, packed, and kept open so wheels, hooves, and feet can reach the water without sinking too far into mud. Posts stand near the edge, darkened by weather and use, and a few pilings mark the place where the landing holds against the current. A plank, a rope, or a worn timber edge may show where the boat usually touches. Across the channel, the opposite bank shows another worked place, smaller from this side, but shaped for the same use. Before the crossing begins on the water, it has already begun on land, in the slope that can be trusted, the angle where a boat can come in, and the patch of firm ground where people and cargo can wait before moving to the other side. A ferry made the passage possible, but only when the bank, the boat, and the water came close enough to agreement. People waited near the landing, with bundles set down beside them. Animals were kept back until the craft was ready. Wagons had to be lined up straight, because a poor angle could make loading slow or unsafe. Cargo came forward in smaller groups, lifted or rolled across planks, then balanced where the boat could carry it. The ferryman read the place through ordinary signs: the pull of the current, the depth beside the bank, the firmness underfoot, and the room available on the far side. Ice could stop the passage completely. A softened bank could turn a short crossing into a long delay. Later, even when vehicles replaced wagons at many crossings, the same practical needs remained: a road that reached the water, a surface that held weight, and a crossing point where the work could be repeated. Where crossings became regular, more fixed riverworks appeared along the edge. A bridge approach answered the old ferry problem in heavier form. Land traffic still had to be brought down to the channel, carried over it, and returned to firm ground beyond the bank. Piers stood in the water to hold the span above the current. Reinforced banks kept the approach from slumping after rain or high water. Timber edges, stone facing, steps, ramps, and short quays gave people a more exact line between land and boat. None of these details was ornamental. Each one settled a small problem at the water's edge. A person could step down at a chosen place. A cart could reach a loading edge. A bridge could gather road movement into a narrow passage and carry it across the Missouri without waiting for a boat. Repeated use changed the ground around these crossings. Roads bent toward the ferry or bridge because that was where the river could be passed. A small building might stand near the approach for storage, repair, shelter, or the handling of fares and instructions. Nearby, an open yard gave space for waiting teams, stacked cargo, and tools kept close to the bank. Fresh tracks crossed older ones in the packed earth. The river edge became a working threshold rather than an unused margin. Goods moved from wagon to boat, from boat to shore, or from one road to another after the crossing. A blacksmith, storekeeper, boatman, or team driver might stay close to the same approach because the movement already gathered there. The activity did not have to be large to leave a clear mark. Even beside a modest settlement, the pattern was visible in the worn surface. Traffic narrowed near the water, paused at the crossing, and spread again once it had passed the river. The bank kept the marks of that rhythm in compacted soil, cut ramps, scraped timber, and tracks pressed into the approach. At the engineered edge, the Missouri still pressed against the work placed there. Floodwater could tear at a ramp, lift loose planks, or leave driftwood packed against pilings. Ice could crowd the landing and make a ferry useless for a time. Erosion opened gaps beside reinforced sections, and mud collected where wheels needed firmness most. Sandbars shifted the best line of approach, so a landing that once met good water could become too shallow or awkward to use. Each repair returned to the same practical exchange between built access and moving river. A post reset, a bank packed again, a wall extended, a slope cut to a safer angle. As crossings and landings became more permanent, the work did not stay at single points. The same need for reliable access was carried along longer stretches of the Missouri, into banks, channels, and working edges reshaped so the river could be approached with less uncertainty. At a working shore on the Missouri, the landing slope is marked by boards, wheel ruts, and packed earth darkened by river mud. Boats lie close to the bank where the water is deep enough to receive them, their lines made fast to posts set above the usual reach of the current. Cut timber waits back from the edge. Sacks and crates stand in rough order between the slope and the storage sheds. The ground is worn where people move from boat to shore and back again, carrying what cannot remain long beside the water. A low shed door stands open toward the landing, and the shortest path between the two is kept clear. This narrow strip is not river and not yet town. It is the place where a load leaves the current, passes through hands, and becomes shore work before it can move inland. Cargo reached the bank in small, practical stages. A boat came in close, was steadied against the landing, and the first loads were brought over planks or lifted from the deck. Sacks of grain could be carried toward a warehouse wall or set under cover until a cart was ready. Crates and barrels were placed where they could be checked, shifted, and sent toward a road, a mill, or a nearby market space. Timber needed more room, so it lay lengthwise on open ground, away from the wettest mud but still close enough to be moved again. Fish or smaller goods were handled quickly, set into baskets, and taken up the bank before the next load came ashore. Nothing was finished, simply because it touched land. Each load had to be weighed, sorted, stacked, repaired, or redirected. The landing worked only if the space between boat and building stayed open, and if each load had a known place to pause before it moved again. Along the same edge, craft and repair belonged to the daily use of the river. A boatman checked a seam where water had worked into the wood, while a carpenter fitted a plank or set a damaged piece aside. Lines were coiled where they could dry. Nets or fish baskets were lifted from the water and laid out where the catch could be cleaned, counted, or carried away before heat and mud spoiled it. A mill worker might wait for grain to arrive from a boat, while a loader adjusted a handcart near the shed. The tools stayed close to the work. Rope, wedges, poles, hook and scales, saws, and simple benches that could be moved when the bank became crowded. These trades were not placed beside the river by accident. They stayed near the landing because boats needed mending, loads needed handling, and fish, timber, and grain all had to pass from water traffic into work done by hand. Repeated use turned the shore into part of local routine. Buildings faced the landing rather than turning away from it, with doors wide enough for sacks and barrels to pass through without being set down too often. A yard was left clear because loading needed room more than decoration. Paths from nearby fields, shops, or mills bent toward the same river edge, not because it was the only bank available, but because it was the bank that could be used again. On days when a boat arrived, work gathered there in a steady order. A crew securing the line, a cart waiting above the mud, a storekeeper checking a load before it went into storage. By the end of the day, the bank might be scraped clean in places and deeply marked in others. Market activity stayed close to the access point because distance added labour. The useful shore pulled small tasks toward it, and the marks of those tasks remained in scraped planks, worn thresholds, and the compacted track between landing and shed. At the edge itself, the work remained exposed to the Missouri's changes. High water could cover the lower boards and push drift against tide boats. Mud softened the approach until a loaded cart cut too deep into the ground. Ice stopped handling altogether or left broken surfaces where a landing had been kept clear. A damaged bank could make the safest route down to the boat unsafe by the next season, and a sandbar could shift the depth just enough to move the usable line of access. Then the same shore had to be adjusted. Planks raised, posts reset, timber dragged back, a ramp cut again, stored goods moved farther from the flood mark. The labour left more than marks in the ground. It left habits attached to particular banks, known places for loading, waiting, mending, selling, and setting out again. Over time, those habits gave certain stretches their own customs. Where a boat tied first, where a cart waited, where fish were counted, and where people returned when work along the river began again. A familiar bank could be known by the work done there, even without a marker on the shore. Fields close to the Missouri often begin just behind the worked bank, where the ground flattens enough for fences, tracks, and open rows. A strip of grass or brush may stand between the channel and the first usable land, but the connection is visible from the bank. Hay meadows spread across lower ground, and cattle or horses graze where the soil holds dampness after rain. A farm track follows the edge of a terrace before turning toward a gate, then toward a barn set farther back from the flood reach. Fence lines bend around a low swale or an older watermark, and rows may stop short of ground that stays too wet to trust. The land has been arranged around the places where the Missouri leaves moisture, where the ground can be worked, and where people decide how close a field or animal can safely come to the channel. The useful soil near the river comes from repeated contact with water. Past floods have carried fine sediment across the low ground and left it behind in thin layers, smoothing small hollows and renewing parts of the floodplain. In some places, the soil holds moisture longer than higher, drier land nearby. So hay can grow thick on flatter meadows, and pasture can remain useful after surrounding slopes begin to dry. A cultivated plot may follow the shape of an older channel edge, where the ground is level enough to work and rich enough to repay the labour. The bank itself can show the same mixture that supports the fields. Dark, damp soil over lighter sand, roots gripping a cut edge, and silt collected where water once slowed. Farmers did not need to see the whole river system to read those signs. They could see which patches stayed green, which ground dried too quickly, and which low fields still carried the mark of the last high water. Where water was useful but uncertain, small works appeared along the fields. An irrigation ditch might run from a pump or side channel toward a row of crops, shallow enough to be cleaned by hand when sediment collected in it. A drainage cut could lead away from a meadow that stayed wet too long after the river fell. Along some edges, a levee or raised track separated the field from ordinary high water, while leaving a gate, culvert, or low opening where water still had to pass. These works were often plain. A cut through the grass, a low bank of push soil, a pipe near a pump, or a cleared field edge could decide whether water reached the crop, left the pasture, or stood too long around the roots. The work aimed at a narrow seasonal balance, enough moisture for growth, enough drainage for machinery and animals, and enough distance from the channel to keep the land usable. Farm routines followed these river-shaped lines. Barns and sheds were often placed a little higher, where tools, hay, and animals would be safer when the low ground flooded. Fields stretched across the flatter land below, sometimes following old bends, terraces, or strips of soil that the river had shaped before the present bank was fixed. Movement passed between landing places, farmyards, meadows, and grazing ground along tracks that avoided the wettest hollows. A wagon or tractor needed a firm way down to a field, and animals needed access to water without breaking the bank into mud. Hay was cut where the floodplain opened wide. Fences were repaired after high water. Gates were placed where livestock could be moved quickly to higher ground. Even the distance between barn and meadow was measured by wet ground, usable track, and the need to move before the river rose. The river set the working limits in visible ways, where a field could spread, where a building should stand, and where a path had to rise. At the field edge nearest the Missouri, the balance can be seen in damp soil, crop rows, fence posts, hoof marks, and a bank worn by water. The same flood that leaves new silt can flatten young plants, carry away a fence, or cut a fresh notch into the field. Ice can scrape at the bank and leave broken timber where a crossing or watering place once held. In a dry season, pumps and ditches may reach less water than before, and pasture near the river can lose the steady moisture that made it valuable. When the channel shifts or a sandbar changes the current, the edge of workable land may change with it. A farmer answers with repairs, a new fence line, a ditch cleaned again, or a field left unused until the ground firms. Beyond these managed acres, the river corridor continues into places less neatly divided. Wet margins, rough grass, young trees, animal paths, and muddy ground where the Missouri still shapes life beyond the ordered field. Beside a reshaped stretch of the Missouri, the bank rises in a clean, worked line instead of falling away through brush and soft, low ground. Stone riprap covers the slope where water would otherwise cut into soil. At the toe of the bank, smaller stones settle between larger ones, filling gaps where the current would otherwise begin to pull. Above it, a levee runs back from the channel as a raised wall of earth, with a worn track along its crown for inspection and repair. In the water, a wing dike reaches out from the bank, catching the current at an angle and pushing more flow toward a maintained channel. The river still moves with its own force, but its edge has been narrowed, strengthened, and watched. Fields begin behind the flood defense, and a road follows ground that once may have been too wet or uncertain for regular traffic. From the slope itself, the arrangement is plain: stone against water, earth raised behind it, and useful land held apart from the channel. The reshaping came from practical pressure along the river corridor. Boats needed a channel deep enough and clear enough to follow. Landings and bridge approaches needed banks that would not collapse after every rise in water. Farms and towns needed some protection from floods that spread across low ground and left work, buildings, and roads damaged behind them. A stable reach made movement easier to plan. A reinforced bend kept a road from being cut off. A maintained navigation line reduced the chance that sandbars would turn an ordinary passage into delay. Along the Missouri, control often meant holding the channel, trimming the river's wandering edges, and giving people a more reliable place to bring boats, machinery, crops, and supplies. An embankment, a dredged reach, or a line of stone at the bend answered the same pressure. The river was useful in motion, but hard to live beside when that motion shifted without warning. Farther along the corridor, the work became larger and more continuous. Dams and reservoirs held back water in broad managed basins, changing the timing and force of flow below them. Controlled releases could raise or lower downstream water levels for navigation, flood control, water supply, and power. Dredging kept selected reaches usable where sediment gathered too heavily. Drainage works removed water from ground that had once stayed wet for longer parts of the year. Flood defences stood between the channel and settlements, sometimes close to the bank, sometimes set farther back across the floodplain. These works overlapped. A reservoir changed the river's pulse. A levee changed where floodwater could spread. A dredged channel changed how sediment moved through a bend. Together, they made the Missouri less free to shift across its lowlands and more dependent on planned release, inspection, and repair. The surrounding landscape carried the change in visible form. Behind a levee, fields could be planted with greater confidence, roads could stay open more often, and buildings could stand where flood risk had been reduced. A town edge might face the river from behind a protected bank, with warehouses, roads, or utilities placed closer to water than would have been safe without defence. But the same control reduced many of the side places that had belonged to the older river corridor. Side channels could be cut off from the main current. Wetlands could dry, or receive water only under managed conditions. Sandbars that once shifted and renewed themselves could become smaller or less frequent, and floodplain forests could lose the flooding that helped shape their growth. Fish and birds still used what remained, but their space was changed by banks that no longer opened as easily, by water levels held to a schedule, and by edges built to resist erosion instead of moving with it. At the maintained edge, the work is never finished. Water presses against stone facing, sediment collects in places meant to stay open, and floods still test the height and strength of levees. After high water, machinery may return to reset rock, clear drift, rebuild a damaged slope, or cut sediment from a channel where depth has changed. A lined bank can still fail beside the protected section, and a stabilized bend can send pressure farther downstream. The Missouri continues to move material through the corridor, even where its course has been held between built limits. Along a dredged bend or a levee slope, control and resistance appear in the same view: water against stone, mud against machinery, a repair track above a current that has not stopped working. Beyond these engineered banks, the remaining margins of the Missouri show what was altered, what was protected, and what still lives beside the managed water. At a bend of the Missouri, the two banks do not answer each other in the same way. On one side, a road comes down to a landing with packed ground, weathered posts near the water, and buildings close enough to face the channel. On the other, the land opens into fields and lower bottom land, with a smaller track passing through grass before it reaches the bank. The river lies between them as moving water, and as a line that changes how each side is used. A boat can follow the channel along both banks, but a person at the edge cannot simply pass across. The opposite shore is near enough to read in detail. A fence, a cut bank, a line of trees, the pale mark of a path. It is also held apart by current, depth, mud, and the few places where crossing can be done. Before any border is named, the water has already made a difference between here and there. Movement across the Missouri gathered at selected points. A ferry landing, a bridge approach, or a firm slope through the bank made one place usable while long reaches nearby remained difficult to enter or leave. The bank had to hold weight. The water had to be deep enough for the craft, and the current had to allow a safe angle from one side to the other. Where those conditions met, movement became regular. Travellers waited at the road end. Goods were set down near the landing. Animals were kept back until the crossing was ready. Farther along the bank, brush, soft mud, steep cuts, or shifting sand could make the river hard to cross at all. The Missouri could be followed for distance, but not crossed at will. Access depended on the few places where ground, water, and local control made passage possible. At a watched crossing, the wide valley narrowed into practical decisions. Where to wait, where to unload, and where to step onto the other bank. The river often became a practical marker for territory and administration. A county line, a state edge, a trade area, or a military route could be drawn with the river in mind, but the line became visible only where people had to use it. A road ended at a ferry point. A post stood near a crossing. A warehouse faced the landing because goods from one side had to be handled before moving into the other. On maps, a boundary could look clean. At the bank, it passed through planks, tracks, waiting yards, and the place where a boat touched shore. Officials, soldiers, traders, or local crews did not need to occupy every bend to shape movement. They watched the places where movement narrowed. A sign, a gate, a ferry schedule, or a guarded approach could make the river's dividing role part of ordinary travel and trade. The administrative line entered the landscape through repeated stops, checked loads, and roads that led to one bank before continuing from the other. The same crossing points also made contact between different banks unavoidable. A load brought down from fields on one side could be carried across to a market road or storage building on the other. Travellers stepped off a ferry into a different pattern of paths, prices, instructions, or work routines. Boat crews heard local speech at the landing, then carried news and small habits onward with the next movement of goods. Near river towns, the bank handled difference through plain tasks. A barrel checked before transfer, a wagon turned toward another road, a message passed while the boat was made ready again. The Missouri divided the ground, but crossing places mixed its edges. Contact did not spread evenly along the whole channel. It gathered where people waited, loaded, paid, asked directions, or watched the far bank for the ferry's return. The landing made the line usable by separating the banks and by giving each side a fixed place to meet the other. At one crossing bend, the separation remains easy to see. The near bank is cut into a road and landing slope, while the far side rises through trees or opens into fields beyond a narrow strip of mud. Between them, the current carries sediment past a line that people have used as if it were fixed. Yet the Missouri could disturb such lines without warning. A flood might eat into one bank and build new ground on the other. Ice could close a crossing and leave broken timber where the approach had been kept clear. A channel could shift enough to make an old landing shallow, awkward, or too far from the deepest flow. Routes had to be repaired, signs moved, and access points adjusted to water that did not follow the same boundary as a road or survey. Even a familiar crossing could need a new plank line, a higher post, or a road edge packed again after water had passed. By next season, the usable edge could sit a little elsewhere. Beyond the lines drawn along the river, the margins kept changing. Bank, mud, grass, trees, and current working at divisions that people could mark, cross, and manage, but never fully hold still. At the city riverfront, the Missouri meets a built edge before it reaches open ground. A levee or raised bank holds the water below a line of streets, and a bridge approach comes down toward the channel on a firm, guarded slope. Warehouses stand with their doors turned toward the river, close enough for goods to move without crossing too much ground. A loading yard opens between the buildings and the bank, with room for carts, later trucks, and crews working near the old access line. The street nearest the water is not arranged for a view. It follows the landing, the bridge, the storage wall, and the route leading away from the shore. Open gaps between buildings give traffic room to turn, wait, and unload. In this part of the city, the riverfront is not an edge left over after the city was built. It is where the first useful streets, yards, and working blocks could be placed. A larger town could grow where the Missouri offered a usable shape in the land. A firm bank above ordinary floodwater gave buildings a safer place to stand while keeping them close to the channel. A bend, landing, or confluence could bring river traffic to a point where roads were already able to climb from the floodplain. A bridgehead fixed movement more strongly, drawing traffic to one crossing instead of leaving it scattered along uncertain banks. The site was rarely perfect. It needed enough height to avoid regular damage, enough lower ground to reach boats, and enough open space for goods and people to gather before moving inland. Where those conditions met, the river entered the city's structure. Streets extended from the bank. Storage stayed near the landing. Traffic from the water could be received without losing itself in soft ground. As the riverfront became more organized, the city's layout turned toward access. Streets ran down to the water where loading could happen, then climbed back towards safer ground. Warehouses and older commercial blocks lined the working edge, because sacks, barrels, timber, tools, and food moved first through the riverfront before spreading farther into town. Mills or yards stood where material could arrive by boat and leave by road or rail. A bridge approach gathered wagons, pedestrians, later vehicles, and freight into a fixed line across the channel. Rail and road links did not erase the river's role. They often strengthened it by joining land routes to the same places where boats had already stopped. The connections remain visible in ordinary details. A street that widens near a landing, a yard left open beside a warehouse, a road bending toward a bridge, and lower blocks built first for movement, not comfort. The same arrangement also showed where the city was most exposed. The lower riverfront carried the heavier work because it was closest to boats, loading edges, and transport links. Higher ground held safer streets, more permanent buildings, and places less likely to be reached by ordinary floods. Between both levels, ramps, steps, roads, and later flood defences marked the adjustment between access and risk. A levee could protect the city, but it could also put a wall between the streets and the water that had drawn work there in the first place. An embankment made the bank stronger, while narrowing the places where a person or load could reach the channel. When high water came, the working district felt the pressure first. Doors sandbagged, yards cleared, lower roads closed, and the river watched from the protected side of the wall. The city depended on the riverfront, but part of it had to stand back from the river it used. At the controlled city edge, the pieces meet in a compressed line. Bridge piers, levee slope, warehouse walls, road surfaces, loading space, and the Missouri moving below them. The city needs the river close enough for movement, but not so close that a flood can spread through its lower streets without resistance. It needs banks firm enough for bridges and roads, yet open enough for work to reach the water. Sediment still gathers near the channel edge. Ice can press against structures, and high water can test the defences meant to hold the river below the city. Repairs, raised walls, redirected roads, and strengthened banks show how the relationship is maintained rather than settled. Beyond the formal riverfront, older habits remain attached to particular crossings, landings, and banks, places where people waited, loaded, watched the water, and learned which edge of the Missouri could be trusted for the next movement. A road end, a warehouse door, or a worn patch beside the levee could keep that memory in use long after the first landing had changed. At a familiar bank near a Missouri town, the path to the water is easier to see than any marker beside it. Feet have cut a narrow line through the grass, then widened it where people turn toward a landing or fishing place. A few posts stand near the edge, rubbed smooth where ropes have been tied. The ground is kept open enough for a small boat to be pulled in, or for people to gather without standing in brush. Farther back, a road or street leads toward the same access point, as if the bank has become part of the settlement's ordinary route. The place does not need a monument to show repeated use. It shows it in packed soil, a cleared slope, a repaired edge, and the way people know where to step when they come down to the Missouri. Even a small change in the bank is noticed here, because the same turn, the same firm patch, and the same line of descent are used again. Customs along the river often began as practical returns. Fishers came back to the same reach when the current slowed near the bank, or when a side channel gave them room to work. Boats were checked before a crossing, lines replaced, and loose boards repaired before high water made the task harder. Harvest movement could bring wagons or trucks toward the landing, with sacks, tools, or small loads waiting near the edge before they were taken away from the river. Market days gathered close to these access points because goods arriving by water or crossing from the other side had to pause somewhere firm. The routine was plain: arriving, waiting, loading, mending, selling, returning. Over time, the repeated action gave certain banks a place in local habit, not as a story set apart from work, but as a stretch of ground used at the same moments year after year. What was done there became familiar because it had to be done in nearly the same place, where the boat could touch, where the road could reach, and where the bank could hold people without failing underfoot. Some gatherings beside the Missouri carried a more formal purpose, but they still depended on the same physical access. A baptism could take place where the bank lowered safely enough to reach the water. A memorial gathering might stand at a town, shore, ferry site, or boat landing, because that was where a person had worked, crossed, or last been seen near the river. A blessing of boats or a community event needed an open edge, a stable path, and enough level ground for people to stand together without crowding the bank. Such gatherings might leave almost nothing behind except trampled grass, a cleared approach, or a path used again at a certain time. Nothing had to be staged beyond the act itself. The bank supplied the place because people already knew how to reach it. The same slope used for work could also hold prayer, farewell, thanks, or remembrance, with the water close enough to be part of the action and the town or road still visible behind it. Shared memory formed most strongly where use met risk. Families remembered which flood rose high enough to cover the lower road, which winter ice tore away a post, and which crossing became unsafe after the current cut into the bank. Older workers could point to the place where boats once landed more easily, or where a sandbar shifted the usable water away from the shore. A fishing spot might be remembered not only for a catch, but for the way the bank had to be approached after rain. The knowledge stayed practical: when not to cross, where the mud gives way, how far back to tie a boat, which fence line marks the old flood reach, and when animals should be moved from low ground. These details pass through repair and warning more than through ceremony. A landing rebuilt after high water, a path cleared again through brush, or a bench replaced above the flood mark, carried what had happened there into the next season of use. Back at the used bank, the marks remain small and specific. A path is kept open because people still walk it. A post is reset because boats still need a place to tie. A fishing place is revisited because the current still slows near the same bend, even if the bank has changed a little. The river edge is held in local knowledge through ordinary return. Someone checks the water level, someone repairs a plank, someone brings a child to the shore and points out where the ferry once came in. The lesson stays attached to the place itself, to a slope, a post, a patch of mud, or the safer line down to the water. Habit gives the bank its shape as much as timber or stone does. From these repeated places, the Missouri becomes attached not only to shared routines, but also to particular lives. Boatmen, fishers, farmers, ferrymen, workers, families, and named people whose paths cross the river at landings, towns, workshores, and changing banks. At a measured edge of the Missouri, the human mark may be no larger than a gauge fixed to a bridge pier or a metal marker set above the bank. Below it, water moves past stone facing, mud, roots, and the shadow of the bridge. Nearby, a levee line lifts across the low ground, and a navigation sign faces the channel where boats need warning before a bend, pier, or shallow reach. On a cut bank, an old survey mark may sit above layers of silt and sand, placed where the ground could be found again after a season of high water. These traces are plain, but they come from close attention. Someone marked a flood height, mapped the bend, sounded the depth, measured the bank, or drew a line where a future structure might stand. Before a crossing could be built, before a bank could be reinforced, and before a route could be trusted, the river first had to be watched as a moving, changing place. The work began with practical description. Surveyors followed banks that did not stay fixed for long. Navigators noted where the current ran close to shore, where a sandbar narrowed the usable channel, and where a landing could be reached without pulling a boat into soft mud. Mapmakers placed bends, islands, crossings, and settlements into order on paper. Record keepers wrote down flood levels, ice damage, bank failures, and changes in depth after high water. A useful note could be as plain as a difficult bend, a shallow reach, or a firm bank near a road. The record did not need to make its writer known. It mattered in the next use. A crew watching the channel, an engineer finding where the bank had failed before, or a town remembering how high the water had climbed in an earlier season. Once gathered, those records began to shape decisions along the water. A map could guide a road toward a better crossing instead of a weak bank. A navigation chart could keep traffic inside a maintained reach where depth had been checked. Flood measurements could support the raising of a levee, the placement of a bridge approach, or the choice to keep buildings farther back from low ground. Engineering plans turned notes about current, sediment, and bank strength into stone-facing, dredged channels, piers, and protected slopes. Laws and local rules gave some of those plans authority, marking where building was limited, where repair was required, or where a wetland or side channel should be left open. Written lines became physical lines, a levee following a surveyed course, a bridge resting where the ground could hold it, a dredged reach kept open by repeated work, and a restored bank fenced off while roots and grass returned. The effects were visible in the way people used the river after the work was done. Navigation became safer, where markers, charts, and maintained channels gave crews a clearer path through changing water. Crossings became more dependable where bridges and approaches were placed according to measured banks rather than guesswork. Flood defences gave towns and farms more room to work behind raised ground, while narrowing the places where floodwater could spread. Later, scientists and conservation workers left a different kind of mark. A side channel might be protected. A wet margin might be rebuilt. A sandbar might be managed so fish, birds, and young trees could keep some room in the altered corridor. These efforts did not erase earlier changes. They added another layer of human decision, one that tried to keep parts of the river's living edge from disappearing under the same control that made travel and settlement more secure. Back at the river edge, one gauge on a pier can hold many of these traces together. The marks on it record water levels that once rose against the bridge. The pier stands where engineers trusted the ground and current enough to carry a crossing. The nearby bank may be lined with stone, while a lower margin beyond it carries reeds, damp soil, and young trees returning where access has been limited. Around that small scene are the records of many people. Surveyors measuring, crews sounding depth, officials approving works, engineers drawing lines, writers describing damage, and conservation workers marking what should be protected. Their names may not be visible from the bank, but their work remains in the route of the bridge, the height of the levee, the maintained channel, and the protected margin. After people measured, governed, and changed the Missouri, the remaining edges still show water, land, plants, and animals responding beside every line drawn there. At a muddy slope on the Missouri, the surface breaks against roots reaching down from a cut bank into clouded water. Close to shore, the current slows and turns around exposed wood, soft clay, and small ridges of sand. Farther out, the main channel carries a heavier pull, with suspended silt giving the water its brown-grey weight. The bottom is not a smooth floor. It rises and falls through bars, holes, shelves, and shifting patches of mud and sand. A root tangle that looks like drift from above becomes cover below the surface. A shallow margin that seems too clouded to show much may hold small fish, insect larvae, drifting plant fragments, and pockets of slower water. Even the thin line where mud meets current can change from open edge to shelter as water rises or falls. Here, habitat is shaped by the bank, the current, the bed, and the brief places where moving water loses force. Flow organizes life in the river before anything else. In faster water, oxygen is mixed through the current, and food is carried downstream in steady movement. Small organisms, loose organic material, and insects enter the flow, passing through places where fish can feed without leaving cover for long. But the strongest current is not always the safest place to hold. Along bends, behind sandbars, beside root masses, and in backwaters, slower water gives fish a place to stay with less effort. Young fish use shallow margins where the depth is low, the current is reduced, and larger predators have less room to move. Deeper holes can shelter life during heat, cold, or falling water. The river is used unevenly. A few meters can separate a fast feeding lane from a protected pocket, a warm, shallow edge from cooler depth, or open current from the shelter of wood and roots. A fish may move between those places through the day as light, temperature, and water level change. Survival often depends on those small differences, not on the width of the river as a whole. The Missouri's sediment adds another layer to that arrangement. Clouded water changes what can be seen, how animals feed, and how exposed they are to one another. For some fish, turbidity gives cover in open water. For others, feeding depends more on scent, vibration, or close-range movement than on clear sight. Sand and silt also reshape the bed beneath them. A bar may build where the current slows, making shallow water that warms quickly and supports feeding. A fresh layer of fine sediment may cover older bottom. Stronger flow can scour a hole or clear a patch of coarser material. Spawning and feeding areas can appear, shift, or be disturbed after high water. Eggs, young fish, and bottom-dwelling organisms all depend on whether the bed stays stable long enough or is turned over too often. The riverbed is not background here. It is part of the living place, remade by current, sediment, depth, temperature, and oxygen moving through the water. The banks feed that underwater life as well. Roots hold pockets of slower current and give young fish a broken edge to use instead of open water. Fallen branches and submerged wood create small shadows, pressure breaks, and surfaces where insects and other organisms can cling. Aquatic plants, where they can hold in shallow or quieter water, slow the flow enough for fine material and small life to collect. Shade from the bank can cool a narrow edge during hot periods. Leaves, stems, and other organic matter enter the water and move into the feeding chain. A bank that slumps into the river may disturb the margin, but it can also make a new cut face, a deeper pocket, or a tangle of roots newly exposed to the current. The edge is seldom a simple boundary. It supplies cover, shade, food material, and changes in speed within reach of the main channel. Near one root mass, Small fish may hold almost still while the main current carries sediment past them. Their bodies turn into the flow, making slight corrections as water pushes around the roots and returns toward the channel. Below them, fine sand shifts in thin lines across the bed. Above them, the bank holds grass, exposed clay, and a narrow mark where higher water has recently stood. The same small place offers shelter, food, oxygen, and risk along a short stretch of shoreline. If the water rises, the margin widens and new stems, roots, and low ground come into use. If it falls, the pocket may become too shallow. A change in level, temperature, current, or sediment changes how the place can be used. From this submerged edge, the view returns to the meeting line itself. Water against mud, roots entering the current, insects along the damp bank, and river life continuing where the channel touches land. At the edge of the Missouri, the bank changes from firm ground to mud in only a few steps. Roots hold the cut face where water has opened the soil, and reeds stand in a shallow strip where the current slows beside the main channel. A small side pool lies behind the first line of plants, clouded with fine sediment but almost still beside the river beyond it. Damp floodplain grass grows near the watermark, and fallen leaves collect where the bank dips toward the pool. The main Missouri moves past with more force, carrying silt along the outer current, while this margin holds slower water against roots and stems. Water seeps through the bank, covers mud, and gathers in places that are neither dry land nor riverbed. Along this meeting line, the edge becomes habitat through depth, softness, shade, and its distance from the stronger flow. The margin works differently because the water gives small life cover and less force to resist. Insects move through wet stems, under loose bark, and across mud that remains damp after the river falls. Amphibians can use shallow pools where the current does not pull eggs or young away at once. Young fish hold near roots and reeds, close enough to reach drifting food but protected from the faster channel. Small mammals follow the softened bank, where plants grow thick and openings to the water are short. Birds use the same edge from above, stepping through shallows, searching in mud, or nesting where reeds and floodplain plants give cover. None of this use is spread evenly along the shore. A bare, steep-cut bank offers one set of conditions. A reedy backwater offers another. The differences are local. A few centimeters of depth, a patch of shade, a root mat, a slow turn in the water, or a muddy shelf where feeding can happen without full exposure to the channel. Seasonal change keeps remaking these edge places. When the Missouri rises, water can spread into side arms, low wetlands, and old depressions behind the bank. A pool that was separate in a dry period may reconnect briefly to the channel, allowing fish and other aquatic life to move in and out. As the level falls again, some of that water remains behind in shallow basins, damp hollows, and slow backwaters. Sediment settles there. Seeds catch in wet mud. Insects gather around new plant growth, and amphibians use pools that are warm, shallow, and partly sheltered from larger fish. The retreating water also leaves limits. Some pools dry before young life can leave them, and some margins become too warm or too low to support more than short use. Even then, the wet ground has stored material from the river: fine silt, leaves, stems, nutrients, and the mark of the last high water. The margin is made by rise and retreat as much as by the channel beside it. These soft edges also affect the river around them. A thick stand of reeds slows muddy inflow from nearby ground, letting some sediment settle before the water reaches the channel. Roots hold loose soil in place, not like a wall, but as a tangled layer that reduces small collapses and gives the bank more texture. Wetland plants shade shallow water, so the edge does not warm as quickly everywhere, and the covered margin can keep young fish and insects out of direct heat. During high water, low side areas store part of the spread, holding it in pools and saturated ground before it drains back or sinks down. The same plant material that shelters animals also catches drift, filters fine particles, and adds organic matter as stems break down. Seen from one bank, each effect is small. Along the corridor, it repeats wherever water is allowed to slow, spread, and meet living roots, instead of only stone or bare-cut soil. Near a shallow pool beside the main river, a small bird steps through the edge water, placing its feet between reed stems and soft mud. Each movement stirs a faint cloud from the bottom. Then the water settles again around the plants. Below the surface, insects move through flooded grass, while young fish hold near the darker line of roots at the pool's outlet. A few meters away, the Missouri's main current passes with more speed, carrying sediment beyond the slower margin. The two waters remain connected, but they are not the same place. One carries the river forward, the other holds shelter, food, and damp ground long enough for life to use it. When the level rises, the pool widens into grass and roots. When it falls, mud appears again and the edge tightens back toward the channel. Downstream, the bank changes from reed to root, from mud to sand, from open edge to shaded backwater, and the living margin continues as a shifting line beside the Missouri. An old map spread near the Missouri shows a curve of ink where the channel once bent across the low ground. A crossing is marked near a small settlement name, and a route line follows the river before turning inland toward higher land. Outside the paper, the present bank may not match that drawn bend. The water may stand farther from one old edge, or cut closer to another, with mud, roots, and sand showing where the channel has changed. The map tries to hold the river still long enough for people to use it. It places a landing, a tributary mouth, a road, or a border beside water that never stayed fixed in one shape for long. Even the neatest line depends on a bank that may have shifted by the time the map is opened again. Between the drawn channel and the bank outside lies the work of mapping the Missouri, turning moving water into knowledge that could be carried, read, and used away from the shore. The uneven detail on an old map shows what was known and what was still uncertain. A settled stretch may be drawn with sharper bends, named places, crossings, and tributaries set in careful relation to one another. Farther along, the line may loosen into a smoother curve, or pass through blank space where distance was estimated and the bank had not been closely measured. One reach might show sandbars, islands, or side channels, while another gives only the river's general direction. Surveyors, traders, officials, and travellers all added knowledge from the river itself. How long a passage took, where a boat could stop, which bank held firm ground, and where another stream entered the channel. The clearer parts came from repeated travel, measured distance, and notes checked against the water. A blank space was not empty land. It showed where reliable information had not yet been brought back, tested, and turned into a line that others could follow. The practical use of the map lay in the choices it made visible. A landing mark could guide boats toward a bank where cargo had been handled before. A ferry point or bridge site could connect roads that otherwise ended at opposite edges of the channel. Tributaries helped travellers place themselves along the route, while settlements showed where supplies, labour, storage, or local authority might be found. Borders drawn along or near the river gave shape to counties, land claims, trade areas, and zones of control. But those lines became useful only where they met real banks, roads, posts, and crossings. A map could organise movement before a journey began. It could show where to follow the channel, where to leave it, where a bend might slow travel, and where access to the Missouri had already been claimed or watched. The paper line sent people back towards specific places on the shore, a road end, a landing slope, a ferry bank, or a marked confluence. The Missouri also made old maps age quickly. A flood could cut across a bend and leave the older loop quieter, shallower, or partly abandoned. Sandbars could build where a clear channel had been drawn, and the current could shift toward a bank that earlier seemed safely distant. A crossing placed on one map might need a new approach after erosion changed the slope, or after deeper water moved away from the landing. A settlement that once faced the river directly could find its working edge altered by mud, new bars, or a changed channel line. The map did not become useless at once, but it needed correction. A drawn bend might remain as a record of where the river had been, while the bank outside showed what high water, sediment and time had done since. Each revision carried the same admission. The Missouri could be measured, but not finally fixed by measurement. One small detail on the map can bring the whole river edge back into view. A ferry mark beside a bend, a town name near the bank, or a borderline following the channel. On paper, it is only a sign. At the river, it becomes a road ending in mud, a worn slope, a post near the water, or a place where people once waited for passage. The drawn line holds use, control, uncertainty, and change in the same narrow mark. It shows where people tried to make the Missouri legible, and where the river later forced that knowledge to be adjusted. When the map is left behind and the bank comes back into focus, the next layer is not only where the river was drawn, it is what people called it, wrote about it, and repeated from one generation to another. The names, descriptions, and river stories attached to certain bends, towns, crossings, and changing shores. At a town bank on the Missouri, the path to the water is worn into the slope below a street that once led toward a landing. A flood mark remains on a wall or bridge support, set higher than the ordinary surface of the river. Near the bank, old posts, repaired steps, and a cleared strip of ground show where people waited for a ferry, watched a boat come in, or carried goods away from the water. The same ground could hold a worker with a rope, a family waiting with bags, or neighbours looking down after a hard rise in water. A person did not need the whole river to speak of it. One bend that delayed crossings, one landing that turned to mud after rain, one bank that held during high water, or one street that flooded first could be enough. The words began close to use: where to stand, when to cross, how fast the water was rising, and whether the boat would leave before dark. Repeated contact gave the Missouri a place in local speech before it entered more formal writing. People learned to read the river by describing it to one another. They spoke of a dangerous bend because boats had to slow there, or of a good landing because the bank was firm and the road came down at the right angle. Distance could be measured by the time a boat needed against the current, or by the next town, ferry, sandbar, or tributary mouth. A flood year could be remembered by the mark it left on a doorframe, a field, or a low street. Waiting brought its own phrases: waiting for ice to break, for water to fall, for a ferry to return, for a boat to appear around the bend. These were working words. They came from decisions made at the edge, and from the need to tell others what the river had done since yesterday. Written and performed forms drew from the same contact. A poem might follow a boat leaving a landing, but the departure still begins with a real bank, a tide line, and people standing above the mud. A song might carry the rhythm of work along the shore, or the distance between home and the next river town. A travel account could record a shifting channel, the trouble of sandbars, the difficulty of landing, or the relief of reaching a known settlement after hard water. A local tale might begin with a crossing delayed by ice, or a flood that changed the use of a street. Older place stories stayed most grounded when they named a spring, a bend, a bluff, or a crossing that people could still point toward. Longer stories could use the Missouri for movement, loss, work, or return, but the strongest details still came from ordinary contact. Cargo handled at the bank, a boat watched from town, a family leaving by water, or a route made possible because the river could be followed. In river communities, these forms kept practical knowledge attached to place. A remembered line about a flood could tell younger people which part of town the water reached first. A song of departure could preserve the fact of leaving from a known landing, keeping that landing in local awareness after the work there had changed. Stories about a vanished ferry or a boat arrival could keep an older crossing visible after a road or bridge had taken over the movement. The details that lasted were often useful ones. The bank that gave way, the season when ice made passage unsafe, the bend where boats had trouble, or the street where people gathered to watch the river rise. Culture here did not float apart from labour, travel, danger, and return. It stayed close to the bank because the bank was where the river entered ordinary life most directly. One trace may remain as a spoken name for a bend, a written passage about a landing, or a flood line still pointed out on a wall. At the river edge, that trace leads back to a physical action. Someone waiting, crossing, loading, leaving, returning, or measuring the water against a familiar place. The words do not hold the river still. They mark the moments when people had to speak about it because their work, travel, safety, or departure depended on what the Missouri was doing. As attention returns from language to the present bank, the same practical relationship remains visible in roads, levees, boat ramps, warning signs, restored margins, and towns facing the channel. The next view of the river is not only remembered or described, it is the Missouri as it is lived with now, managed, watched, used, and adjusted to in the present day. At a Missouri bank, the river identifies itself before it is compared with anything else. The water is broad and clouded with fine sediment, moving past a worked edge where stone, mud, and sand meet the current. A navigation marker faces the flow, and a raised bank or levee holds the low ground behind it. Along the margin, fresh silt gathers in small ridges, while exposed roots show where the river has cut at the shore before being held back or repaired. This is not a clear, narrow stream with a simple edge. It is a large western river, carrying soil through a valley of fields, towns, bluffs, sandbars, and managed banks. Boats, roads, crossings, and levees have all had to answer to its size, its moving bed, its heavy water, and its habit of changing the place where land and channel meet. Beside the Mississippi, the Missouri becomes easier to place, but only if the comparison stays close to function. The Mississippi is the larger, lower outlet, receiving the Missouri's water and carrying the combined system farther south toward the Gulf. Yet the Missouri does not enter that system as a minor stream. It brings a long course of western water, with sediment gathered from plains, badlands, tributaries, fields, reservoirs, and eroding banks. Where the two rivers meet, the Missouri adds force, volume, and suspended material to a channel already shaped by its own basin. The difference is not only a name on a map. Below the confluence, the Mississippi becomes the main route, but the Missouri changes what that route carries. Its presence remains visible in clouded water, in bars and banks affected by sediment, and in the long record of navigation and river work needed before it reaches the joining place. Compared with the Colorado, the Missouri shows another kind of western river landscape. The Colorado is often understood through arid country, deep canyons, major dams, and the careful division of scarce water. Its channel is strongly associated with rock walls, reservoirs, and the problem of storing and allocating flow in dry regions. The Missouri has also been dammed and regulated, but much of its visible corridor is different. Wider valleys, muddy current, agricultural bottomlands, shifting banks, and long reaches shaped by navigation, flood control, and settlement. Along the Missouri, the work was not only to store water behind a wall, it was to keep a channel usable through sediment, protect fields and towns from high water, and hold crossings, landings, and banks in places that could be approached again. The comparison brings the view back to the Missouri's own corridor, spread through plains and floodplains where water, soil, work, and management stay closely tied. A third comparison can be made with rivers whose banks are clearer, rockier, or more stable over ordinary time. On such a river, a crossing, quay, or landing may keep its relation to the water with less adjustment. A firm bank can make access simpler, and a clearer channel can make hazards easier to see. The Missouri has rarely offered that kind of certainty along its softer reaches. Its sediment-rich water hides depth changes, and its sandbars can alter the line a boat must follow. A usable landing may need repair after floodwater changes the bank. A ferry point, bridge approach, levee, or marker has to be checked against erosion, mud, ice, and the movement of the bed. Settlement near this river depends on repeated attention. Roads bend toward access points that have proven useful, but those points remain conditional. The bank must still hold, the channel must still pass close enough, and the water must still allow a crossing or landing to work. Back at the Missouri's own edge, the comparisons fall away. The current carries silt past a marked reach, and a bend pulls the main flow toward one bank before letting it move on. A reinforced shore holds where the river has been narrowed for use, while softer ground nearby shows where water still leaves its trace. The Mississippi places the Missouri in a larger system, and the Colorado clarifies a different western river logic, but the Missouri is most visible in its own materials: muddy water, shifting sand, managed crossings, worked banks, agricultural edges, and towns set close enough to use the channel while staying alert to it. Here, sediment moves under the surface, markers guide traffic, and the shore keeps the marks of repair. From this bank, the river is no longer being measured against others. It continues downstream into its present condition, watched through the ways people manage, protect, use, and live beside it now. Beside a present-day stretch of the Missouri, a levee path runs above the bank, while the river moves below a line of stone and mud. A bridge crosses the channel, and a boat ramp cuts through the reinforced edge toward water marked by signs and buoys. Behind the flood wall, a road follows the riverfront, with fields, utility structures, or low buildings set close enough to use the corridor, but high enough to avoid ordinary water. The bank is managed rather than untouched. Grass is kept short on the levee slope, rock holds the lower edge, and a gauge or warning sign stands where people need to read the river before they use it. A small boat may leave the ramp in the same view as a farm field, a bridge pier, and a protected strip of reeds. The Missouri here runs beside roads, pumps, ramps, fences, and work sites that depend on the channel being reachable and watched. For nearby communities, the river remains part of a working system. Farms along the corridor depend on moisture held in the soil, water managed through ditches, or pumps used when rainfall is not enough. Intake points serve towns, facilities, and riverfront utilities, pulling water from the channel through screened structures set carefully into the bank. On navigable reaches, channel markers and maintained edges help boats and service craft move through water that still carries sediment and shifting depth. At city edges, roads, bridges, and riverside facilities bring traffic close to the same banks that earlier held landings and warehouses. Industrial yards or utility sites may stand back from the water, but remain connected to it by pipes, roads, docks, or access tracks. Each use is specific: a field watered, a bridge inspected, a ramp kept open, a bank held firm enough for machinery, a marked route kept readable for movement. Because many uses meet along the same corridor, the modern Missouri is managed continuously. Flood planning shapes where levees are raised, where low land remains open, and where buildings stay behind protected ground. Dams and reservoirs upstream affect the timing and amount of water moving through later reaches, while channel maintenance keeps selected routes from becoming too shallow or uncertain. After high water, crews may return to check erosion, clear drift, repair rock facing, or measure where sediment has changed the edge. Pollution control and water quality monitoring add another layer tied to runoff, treatment plants, industrial sites, and the condition of the river downstream. Conservation work also belongs to the present river. A side channel protected, a wetland restored, a sandbar managed, or a planted margin given room where habitat has been reduced. The management is not one single purpose. It is a series of adjustments made where farms, towns, transport, recreation, flood safety, and living margins press against the same water. At some river edges, those pressures are visible side by side. A recreational trail may follow the top of a flood wall, while restored reeds grow below it in a wet strip left open beside the channel. A boat ramp may stand near a protected margin where signs ask users to keep away from nesting or shallow habitat. Farther out, the main current remains marked for navigation, while behind the bank, a field depends on managed water and careful control of runoff. The same place can receive weekend visitors, farm drainage, conservation work, and flood inspection within a short distance. None of these uses removes the others completely, but each one limits how the edge can be treated. A path must stay safe. A wetland must keep enough water. A field must drain without sending too much sediment back to the river. A ramp must remain usable when the level rises or falls. The present-day bank is held between access, protection, work, and habitat. Near one channel marker, the Missouri carries cloudy water past the end of a boat ramp and on toward a bridge shadow. The marker stands because the channel still needs to be read. The ramp remains because people still launch, inspect, fish, work, and travel from the bank. Above it, a levee path gives access for maintenance, while a small restored edge of reeds and damp soil holds water where the current slows. In one view, the river is used, controlled, watched, and partly given room to function. Its present condition is not fixed. It changes with each season of water, repair, demand, and protection. Downstream, the same managed current passes more bridges, fields, towns, side margins, and reinforced banks, carrying the present-day Missouri toward its lower reaches, where the river begins to show more clearly its long approach to the joining place ahead. At a restored edge of the Missouri, the bank no longer drops straight into stone and fast water. A lower strip has been reshaped into wet ground, with young willows, cottonwood saplings, and reeds planted where bare soil once washed away. Behind the first line of plants, a shallow basin holds water after a rise, and a narrow side channel carries slower flow back toward the main current. Farther inland, a levee stands set back from the immediate bank, leaving a wider strip of floodplain between the river and the protected ground. The work is visible in small details. Cut banks laid back to a gentler slope, root mats beginning to hold mud, old hard edges broken by openings, and access tracks showing where crews have recently passed. A few stakes may still mark grade or planting lines above the damp soil. This repair is physical and local. Water is being given places to slow, spread, and touch living margins again. Restoration along the Missouri often begins by changing the contact between water and land. A floodplain area may be reconnected by lowering a barrier or opening a cut so seasonal water can enter when the river rises. A side channel may be cleared enough to carry flow again, giving fish and small life a place away from the strongest current. A former hard bank can be softened where safety allows, replacing a continuous line of rock with planted slopes, root cover, and shallow edge water. Wetland basins can be restored beside the channel so they fill during high water and hold moisture as the level falls. None of these actions returns the river to an untouched state. Roads, farms, towns, levees, and bridges remain nearby, and some banks still have to stay hard where the risk is too high. The work is limited and practical. Make space where space is possible. Slow water where it can safely slow, and rebuild edge conditions that the river and its living systems can use. The biological value comes from those changed conditions. A planted bank gives young fish cover along roots instead of an exposed wall. A side channel offers quieter water where feeding can happen with less force from the main current. Wetland edges collect insects, plant material, and fine sediment, forming shallow feeding zones for fish, birds, and amphibians. Where movement has been blocked or narrowed, a fish passage or improved connection can let life pass a barrier or reach usable side water. Better water quality changes the same places in another way. Less polluted runoff, less loose sediment from disturbed banks, and cleaner inflow from nearby drainage make shallow habitats more usable for eggs, young fish, and bottom life. A restored place does not work because it looks greener from above. It works when depth, current, temperature, cover, oxygen, and access come closer to what living organisms need. Protection still has to remain part of the design. A levee moved farther back can give floodwater more room while keeping a town, road, or field behind a defended line. In other places, a reinforced bank may stay in place near a bridge or utility, while a nearby margin is restored where the risk is lower. Runoff control from farms and towns can be handled through grassed strips, wetland cells, or drainage improvements that slow muddy water before it reaches the channel. These choices belong to flood planning as much as habitat work. They decide where water can spread, where it must be kept out, and where damage can be reduced without hardening every meter of bank. The balance is visible in the layout. A protected road on higher ground, a managed wetland below it, a planted slope between the field and the channel, and an inspection track showing that the work still has to be watched. Repair here is careful and partial because the river is still used and nearby land still has to be protected. At one restored side channel, shallow water enters through an opening in the bank and moves slowly around young roots before returning to the Missouri. Fine sediment settles in the quiet bend, and new plants hold the wet soil along the edge. In higher water, the basin can store part of the spread instead of sending all of it at once against the levee. In lower water, the remaining pools give shelter to small fish and insects while the main current passes nearby. The repaired place is not separate from the managed river around it. It sits beside levees, fields, ramps, roads, and watched water levels, adding function where there is room. A gauge, a service track, or a line of fresh rock may still show how closely the site is managed. Downstream, the edge changes again, from planted bank to open mud, from restored wetland to reinforced reach, from side water back into the main channel. Along that repaired line, the Missouri continues toward its lower reaches, where its water begins to slow, spread, settle, and meet larger systems ahead. At a stressed edge of the Missouri, changing water is recorded in marks rather than noise. A brown line stains a bridge pier above the present surface, left where high water once pressed against concrete and steel. Lower down, the bank has torn open in places, with fresh soil showing behind a skin of roots. Driftwood lies caught against a post, stranded there when the river fell. On the inside of the bend, exposed mud and pale sand stretch farther than usual before the water begins, and a channel marker stands beyond a shallow bar that was hidden in another season. Both pressures are visible at once. The river can rise high enough to test levees, roads, and fields, and it can fall low enough to reveal the bottom, narrow the usable channel, and make access from the bank harder. Even the ordinary path to the water can shift between being covered, usable, and left too far from the channel. When the Missouri rises, the first pressure appears against the edges built to hold it. Water climbs the riprap at the base of a levee, fills low ditches, and reaches the grass at the foot of access roads. In fields set close to the floodplain, shallow water can spread across rows, leave silt over crops, or push debris into fences and gates. Along a cut bank, the current pulls at loosened soil and carries it away in cloudy sheets. Sediment moves with the flood, settling in some places and scouring others. A landing can be covered before the main damage is visible, and a road that usually reaches the bank can become a wet track ending in moving water. After the level rises, crews look for weak places. A seep at the levee base, a slump in the slope, a gap in stone facing, or drift packed against a bridge pier. High water turns the managed corridor into a line of inspections, closures, and repairs. Low water brings a different strain. As the level falls, mud flats widen along the bank, and sandbars rise into the channel where boats once had more room. The deeper path becomes narrower and harder to read, especially where the Missouri carries enough sediment to hide the bed beneath the surface. A boat ramp may end above usable depth, or its lower edge may sit in soft mud instead of water. Navigation markers still point toward a maintained route, but the channel may need dredging where sand has gathered. Shallow water warms more quickly, holds less dissolved oxygen in some edge places, and can leave young fish or other aquatic life in isolated pockets when side water disconnects. Intake pipes, pumps, and working access points all depend on water remaining close enough and deep enough to use. When it falls too far, the problem is no longer how to keep the river back. It becomes how to reach it. The difficulty is that many systems along the Missouri are fixed in place while the river remains variable. A farm field may lie behind a levee on ground the river would still enter during a flood if given room. A bridge, water intake, landing, or utility line depends on a channel that must keep enough depth while sediment moves and banks erode. Roads are built toward access points, but the bank beside them can soften, slump, or be cut away. Navigation relies on markers, dredging, and channel maintenance, yet the riverbed continues to build bars and shift usable water after high flow or long dry periods. The same corridor is expected to carry floods, support farms, serve towns, allow boats, protect habitat, and hold infrastructure. The strain shows where a repaired bank meets a fresh cut, where a levee stands beside wet fields, or where a closed ramp marks a use interrupted by water level rather than choice. Each fixed use needs the river to remain near enough, deep enough, and contained enough, though the water keeps altering those terms. At one bend, the adjustment can be seen in a new line of riprap placed below an older erosion scar. Survey stakes mark the place where the bank will be checked again, and fresh mud lies across the lower path where water recently retreated. Nearby, a boat ramp is partly closed because the channel has pulled away from its end, while a maintenance track follows the levee above the mark left by the last rise. A dredge or workboat may return when depth changes too much, and a crew may reset stone where the current has opened a weak edge. None of these signs settles the problem. They show the repeated work of living beside a river that can bring too much water, too little water, and too much moving sediment for any single structure to answer completely. Downstream, the Missouri carries these tensions toward its lower reaches, passing repaired banks, exposed bars, flood marks, and managed edges on its way to broader ground where the river begins to settle, spread, and approach the larger system ahead. Near the lower Missouri, the channel widens into broad, muddy water, bordered by low banks, sandbars, and floodplain ground close to the river's surface. Wing dikes and other channel structures reach out from the edges, guiding part of the current toward a maintained line while slower water gathers near bars and backwaters. The banks are worked in places with stone, mud, reeds, and service tracks showing where navigation and flood control still need attention. Ahead, the land opens toward the meeting with the Mississippi, not as a seamouth or tidal edge, but as a wide inland confluence where one major river enters another. The Missouri is still itself here, clouded, sediment, heavy, managed, and active, yet the final setting already belongs to more than one river. The water is moving toward the place where its separate channel will end, while its material continues inside a larger current. In these lower reaches, the river can look slower because it spreads across a wider surface, but the movement has not stopped. The main current still pulls through the marked channel, carrying suspended silt and sand past banks that must be watched and maintained. Low bars appear where the current drops part of its load, then change again when higher water cuts across them or shifts their edges. Navigation marks, wing dikes, and dredged reaches show that the lower Missouri still has to be organized for use. A boat following the channel depends on depth that can be altered by sediment after a rise, or a dry period. Along the floodplain, the river sits close to fields, roads, levees, and wet margins, with broad, low ground giving high water room to press outward. The Missouri begins to merge here not because it has become inactive, but because its water and sediment are being delivered into a larger system just downstream. Sediment is part of that final transition. Sand moves along the bed, silt hangs in the water, and finer material gives the lower river its clouded color. Where current slows near the inside of a bend or behind a channel structure, some of that material settles and begins to build a bar or shallow shelf. When water rises again, the same place can be cut, lowered, or carried farther downstream. A bank may receive new mud after a flood, while a navigation line nearby may need attention because the bed has shifted. The Missouri ends its own named course by carrying more than water to the confluence. It carries material that can shape banks, reduce depth, build low ground, and cloud the current it joins. In these last reaches, deposition and removal happen close together, in the same bends, bars, and managed lines of water. This lower river landscape affects work and habitat along the banks without becoming one single kind of place. Around bars and channel structures, maintenance keeps a usable route open where sediment would otherwise make the channel less certain. Crews may read the markers, check depth, clear drift, or adjust an edge where the current has changed its pressure. At the same time, shallow margins and wet floodplain edges provide slower water for young fish, insects, wading birds, and plants that can hold in soft ground. A reedy edge beside a managed bank may trap fine sediment, while the main channel carries heavier flow past it. A backwater behind a bar may warm, fill, drain, or reconnect according to the season. Human work and living margin stand close together here, one keeping movement dependable, the other using the temporary spaces made by mud, shallow water, and a shifting bed. At the confluence, Missouri water enters the Mississippi as a clouded current carrying sand, silt, and the marks of the long channel behind it. For a short distance, the meeting can appear as a visible difference in color and movement, with one flow pressing into the other before the line begins to loosen. The Missouri's banks no longer continue as their own corridor, but its water does not stop. Its sediment joins a larger current, its depth and force become part of another river's movement, and the separate name gives way to the downstream system. Close to the bank, the final details remain practical. Muddy water moving past a bar, a marked channel guiding traffic toward the joining place, and low floodplain ground lying beside the last reach. From here, the next movement follows the combined water onward, away from the Missouri's own course, and into the larger source-to-sea connection carried by the Mississippi. Near the lower Missouri, the river approaches the Mississippi through broad, muddy water, low banks, sandbars, and work channel lines. Wing dikes reach from the shore, pressing part of the current toward a maintained path, while slower water gathers behind bars and along soft floodplain edges. Stone facing, service tracks, navigation marks, and levee slopes show where this last reach has been held, watched, and repaired. This is not a seamouth, delta, or estuary. It is an inland confluence where one major river enters another. The Missouri arrives with its own color, sediment, and movement still visible, while the larger Mississippi system lies ahead. The water reaching this place belongs to the same course that first took shape near Three Forks, Montana, where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers meet in an open mountain valley. There, the young Missouri begins as joined headwater flow, passing gravel, grass, cottonwoods, and the first banks of its named channel. By the time it reaches this lower confluence, that beginning has passed through changes in slope, width, current, and surrounding land. Tributaries have joined it. Sediment has entered, settled, and moved again. Human use has altered many reaches, but the connection remains physical. Headwater streams gathered into one river, and that river carrying its load onward until it meets another. Along the way, the Missouri has moved from mountain valleys into wider plains, taking in tributaries and crossing floodplain ground shaped by high water, drought, erosion, and deposition. Its banks have held crossings, fields, ferry places, bridge approaches, town fronts, and working shores. In some reaches, the river spread into sidewater, bars, and low margins. In others, it was held more tightly by levees, reinforced banks, wing dikes, reservoirs, and maintained navigation lines. It never became one simple kind of river. It passed through open valleys, agricultural edges, managed channels, city fronts, restored margins, and unsettled banks where mud, roots, sand, and currents still changed how the river could be used. Its lower water carries that accumulation in a visible way. Sediment gathered from eroding banks and tributary country clouds the channel and builds bars, shallows, and lower bends. Settlements formed where the bank could be reached, where a crossing could hold, or where roads and trade met the water. Farms used the floodplain's soil and moisture, while living with floodwater, ice, and shifting edges. Fish, birds, insects, and river plants used side channels, roots, wetland basins, sandbars, and shallow margins left between the main current and the worked bank. Parts of the river have been measured, straightened, repaired, protected, and restored. Yet through those reaches, the Missouri has continued to move water and material downstream. Near the Mississippi, these traces return to the visible scene. The surface may look slow, but current lines still run through it, carrying sand and silt past channel marks and low bars. A reinforced bank can stand close to a muddy edge where reeds hold soft ground. A quiet backwater may lie only a short distance from the maintained navigation line. The lower floodplain sits close to the river, open enough to show how levees, roads, fields, and restored wet areas share the same corridor. At the joining place, the Missouri enters the Mississippi as brown water carrying sediment, depth, force, and the long movement of its course. The separate Missouri Channel ends at the confluence. Its water crosses the last visible line between the two river systems and begins to move inside the Mississippi's larger current. Sand and silt continue downstream. The floodplain continues beyond the meeting, but the named course of the Missouri has reached its final point. From the headwaters near Three Forks to this low, managed, sediment-heavy joining place, the river has carried water through banks, towns, fields, tributaries, flood marks, repairs, and living margins. Here, it leaves its own channel and moves on within another river toward the sea.